Welcome to the online module for moral injury in the child protection system. This module presents the results of a study on moral injury among professionals involved with child protection services. This module is the second in a series of 2 modules presenting research on moral injury within the context of child protection. The first module discusses moral injury among parents involved in child protection. Our project team at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work includes Wendy Haight, Professor and LICSW Chair, Erin Sugrue, Doctoral Student and Research Assistant, Molly Calhoun, Doctoral Student and Research Assistant, and Dr. James Black, Staff Psychiatrist at Regions Hospital and Assistant Professor, University of Minnesota, Department of Psychiatry. We are grateful for the financial support of the LICSW Endowment and Federal Title IV-E funding through the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. We will present this module in 5 main sections. First, we will begin with a brief discussion about the importance of retention of professionals in child welfare. Next, we will introduce the concept of moral injury, and then discuss the relevance of moral injury to the context of child protection. Following this, we will present findings from a recent study we have conducted on moral injury among professionals in the child protection system. Finally, we will discuss the implications of our findings on policy and practice within child protective services. This module will take approximately 45 minutes. The issue of the retention of effective professionals is a persistent challenge in child welfare systems. According to the Federal General Accounting Office, national turnover rates in child welfare agencies range between 20% and 40% annually. Additionally, the average worker tenure in child welfare agencies is less than 2 years. Research on turnover has found that high turnover rates affect the quality of services for vulnerable children and families. Worker turnover may delay safe options for permanency and increase children's length of stay in the CPS system. Additionally, high turnover rates may also impact the working conditions experienced by many professionals within these vitally important but highly stressful positions. The challenge of supporting and retaining child welfare professionals may be exacerbated when professionals perceive that their moral values and professional ethics are not congruent with or are constrained by those values enacted in their agencies. Our study examines any moral injury occurring among professionals involved with the child protection system and discusses implications for supporting and retaining effective, ethically engaged child welfare professionals. Moral injury refers to the lasting psychological, spiritual, and social impact of one's own or others' actions that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Although the experience of a violation of one's sense of moral order and normative ethical expectations may be an ancient and even widespread human experience, the use of the term moral injury by mental health practitioners is relatively new. In recent years, clinicians working with veterans of the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars began to recognize that many were suffering from a type of persistent distress that was not being captured by the DSM diagnosis of PTSD or resolved by interventions for PTSD. In contrast to PTSD, which involves a traumatic threat to physical safety and results in anxiety, moral injury occurs in high-stakes situations that contradict one's deeply held moral framework. That is, beliefs about right and wrong that one has long held as sacred. This troubling mismatch between one's core beliefs and events can lead to a breakdown in global meaning, or a threat to the integrity of one's internal moral schema. It is this lack of meaning and integrity, not threat to physical safety, that contribute to individuals' guilt, shame, rage, depression, and loss of trust in their own or others' capacity to behave in an ethical manner. If unaddressed, the lack of meaning, emotional distress, and lack of trust associated with moral injury may persist for years. Although research on moral injury has focused on military personnel, clinical practitioners and qualitative researchers have suggested that moral injury may occur within other high-stakes contexts. Arthur Kleinman, in 2007, described the struggles of humanitarian aid workers and those surviving Mao's Cultural Revolution. In these contexts, the moral values that mattered most to them were transgressed, resulting in feelings of chaos and despair. Robert J. Lifton described how atrocities committed by American soldiers in Vietnam and Nazi doctors resulted in lasting moral harm. These perpetrators expressed guilt, rationalization of their immoral behavior, numbing of emotions, and complex forms of self-sabotage. In her qualitative interviews with homeless women with a history of intimate partner violence, Audie found themes consistent with moral injury, including betrayal and trust issues, social problems, spiritual and existential issues, psychological symptoms, and self-depreciation. Hartman, 2015, described experiences of moral injury in African American women with a history of substance abuse, resulting in feelings of social isolation and shame. Although moral injury has not previously been examined among child welfare professionals, it has been identified and linked to psychological well-being in a variety of other high-stakes helping professions with strong ethical commitments to vulnerable individuals. Keefe, Perry, and Levinson have suggested that public school teachers may experience moral injury within the morally complex and high-stakes settings in which they work, and the ethically challenging actions they are often required to take. The medical literature describes health professionals who experience moral injury-like responses in the context of performing their professional roles. Some scholarship suggests that moral injury may affect professionals' behavior, including their decisions to remain employed in their positions. In a synthesis of the moral distress and retention literatures, Hamrick argues that morally and ethically distressing events are linked to high nursing staff turnover, with some individuals leaving the profession altogether. Within education, moral and ethical factors also may contribute to teachers' decisions to leave their profession. These individuals may express a profound discomfort with the mismatch between their personal morals and professional ethics, and the actions they are required to take in their professional roles. One of the ways in which this discomfort is relieved is through leaving their employment or professions. Given the potential relevance of moral injury to a variety of high-stakes sociocultural contexts, we considered the applicability and significance of moral injury for professionals in the arguably high-stakes context of child protection services, or CPS. Professionals may experience moral injury due to the harm they witness inflicted on children. They also may experience moral injury working within social systems that are charged with providing assistance to struggling families, but instead cause harm. Examples of this systemic harm may be inadequate social services or stigmatizing legal proceedings. If involvement in CPS places professionals at increased risk of moral injury, then moral injury is a critically important construct for social workers to understand and address for recruiting and retaining an effective, ethically engaged child welfare workforce. The research questions that frame our study are as follows. Do some professionals experience moral injury in relation to their experience with CPS? If so, what do professionals identify as morally injurious events? How do professionals describe the psychosocial effects of morally injurious events? And 2, do professionals who report varying levels of moral injury in response to CPS involvement differ in terms of demographic characteristics or professional roles? We employed a mixed methods design for our research on moral injury and CPS professionals. Mixed methods is the intentional integration of qualitative and quantitative research approaches to better understand complex social issues. It is an important methodology to social work because it allows researchers to explore the breadth of a situation through quantitative analysis, while extending a deeper analysis through qualitative interviews. Social work has a long history of mixed methods dating back to Jane Addams and John Dewey in the early 20th century. Mixed methods as a research methodology began to emerge in the 1970s and 1980s, and was really institutionalized as a distinct methodological tradition in the 1990s. Today, the use of mixed methods has continued to flourish and is recognized as an important methodology in social science research. Our primary purpose for the use of mixed methods is complementarity. The use of data from quantitative moral injury assessments and qualitative interviews generates a more comprehensive understanding of any moral injury that may be experienced by CPS-involved professionals. Additionally, this method allows us to triangulate or validate our data across different sources in order to obtain a stronger insight into the experiences of professionals involved in CPS. 38 professionals were recruited through a local law school clinic that provides services to impoverished parents accused of child maltreatment, through LinkedIn, an online professional network, and through snowball sampling. We deliberately sampled professionals serving in diverse roles on CPS cases within the previous year. Our participants were 13 CPS social workers, 5 county attorneys who represent the county against parents accused of child maltreatment, 5 guardian ad litems, or GALs. GALs work for the state, collecting information from parents and children to determine the best interest of children. 10 certified student attorneys from the law clinic, who as second or third year law students have passed an exam allowing them to practice law under the supervision of a fully licensed attorney. And 5 clinic and parent support staff. These staff members included 2 disposition workers in the public defender's office, the director of the law clinic, the coordinator of the parent mentor program associated with the law clinic, and the social work intern supervisor at the law clinic. To assess moral injury quantitatively, the present study employed a modified version of the Moral Injury Events Scale, the MEES, to identify any moral injury in professionals involved with child protection services. The MEES is a 9-item self-report scale designed to identify exposure to potentially morally injurious events among military veterans. Items on the scale are generally applicable to many contexts. For example, I witnessed others' immoral acts. I'm troubled by having witnessed others' immoral acts. I'm troubled by having acted in ways that violated my own morals or values. Several items refer to betrayal by leaders, and others within the military were reworded to be appropriate to the CPS context. For example, I feel betrayed by superiors, e.g. supervisors or judges that I once trusted. The modified version of the MEES used in this study is an 8-item self-report scale designed to identify exposure to potentially morally injurious events among CPS-involved professionals. Professionals were asked to reflect on events surrounding their CPS involvement and to consider the term moral to refer to their own beliefs and values about right and wrong. Using a 6-point Likert scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with higher scores indicating more moral injury, participants were asked to indicate the extent to which they were exposed to events they found morally problematic and the extent to which they were troubled by any transgressions. Scores were calculated for 3 scales involving transgressions by others, betrayal, and transgressions by self. The 3 subscales were averaged across subgroups of professionals and the entire sample. To expand our understanding of CPS-involved professionals' experiences of any moral injury and risk and protective processes, respectively, We employed a qualitative semi-structured interview. We prompted participants to narrate any experiences of moral injury they identified through the MEIS. More specifically, participants were asked to elaborate their responses to items on the MEIS on which they scored 4 or above during the semi-structured interview. For example, the researcher would ask, "I noticed that you chose moderately agree when responding to the question. I acted in ways that violated my own moral code or values. Can you tell me what happened?" After describing the event and context associated with their moral injury, participants were asked to talk specifically about the feelings they experienced in association with the identified events. Participants also were asked if the morally injurious events and their associated feelings affected their self-perception, their relationships with others, or their actions and behaviors. Each interview was audio recorded and transcribed. Themes were induced through analytic induction techniques and then coded by 2 independent researchers. Any disagreements were resolved through discussion and consultation with a third researcher. Our first research question is, do some parents and professionals experience moral injury in relation to their experience with CPS? Our first table shows the demographics of the professionals in the study as well as the mean MEIS scores based on role and as a total group. The majority of professionals were white and female with years of experience in CPS, ranging from a few months to 40 years. Professionals' MEIS scores and descriptions of their own responses suggest that some professionals involved with CPS do experience moral injury as a result of witnessing harm to children, but also as a result of their own involvement with the system. As a reminder, the MEIS is a 6-point scale, with 1 meaning no agreement with the statement and 6 indicating high agreement. The higher scores, the more moral injury. 35 of 38 professionals scored 4 or above on the 6-point Likert subscales, indicating that they had both seen things that were morally wrong associated with their CPS involvement and were troubled by witnessing these transgressions. 12 professionals also scored 4 or above on subscales, indicating that they felt betrayed by people they once trusted. 9 of these professionals also scored 4 or above on the transgression subscale, indicating that they had violated their own morals through specific actions or inactions, and that they were troubled by these violations. In the table, the groups are presented from highest mean MEIS score to the lowest mean score. Notice that clinic and parent support staff have the highest mean MEIS scores, while the county attorneys report being the least affected by moral injury. The second table describes the percentage of professionals who describe various morally injurious events associated with CPS. Professionals talked about problematic behavior both in the context of themselves and other professionals. They also identified problematic actions by parents as well as problematic services. We have shared this report broken down by the 5 clusters as well as the total for all professionals. Of the 38 professionals, all of the 38 professionals described morally injurious events as occurring within contexts in which actions or inactions by people or systems entrusted with helping or protecting vulnerable families instead caused harm. They identified a number of specific events surrounding their work with CPS. 87% of the professionals described morally injurious events involving professionals. Of all professionals, 76 reported witnessing and being troubled by others' morally injurious behavior. 50% of all professionals described that in the context of their CPS involvement, they had acted in ways that violated their own moral codes and that they were troubled by these violations. 68% of the professionals described morally injurious events associated with the harm parents do to their children. On being troubled by others' behavior, a disposition worker said, "I've gotten to the point where with some attorneys I literally am like, I'm not willing to work with you. Like I've told my supervisor, I'm not willing to work with them because I'm not going to sit by and watch them not represent our client and this client just get rolled through the whole thing." A new CPS field worker on the job for 10 months reflected on what troubles her about her work, saying, "Abuse, physical abuse. I mean, seeing that and what kids have to go through Or a lot of cases that I've had in my caseload, they've had prenatal exposure to drugs. I had one recently. It was a baby prenatally exposed to heroin and going through withdrawals, which is really hard for me to see and work with. So that really sticks with me. A defense attorney for CPS involved parents views CPS to be heavily biased. I try not to say point blank to my clients, it's not fair, because I don't think that helps them. And I also think that then they lock into that, and then it's for the rest of the case. Nothing else matters because the situation is unfair. So it doesn't matter that I hurt the kids, it doesn't matter that I need to do treatment. It's like all they focus on is that system bias. So I don't want them to focus on that. But it's laughable if I try to have a conversation about how that's fundamentally not true. So I feel personally conflicted in both situations. Our third table is an extension of the morally injurious events that were identified by CPS professionals. 89% of professionals described morally injurious events as occurring because there are insufficient resources within the system for effective intervention. Insufficient resources lead to caseloads that are too high and services that are inadequate or ineffective. 71% of the professionals describe morally injurious events associated with problematic laws, policies, or procedures. 45% of professionals describe morally injurious events associated with the adversarial nature of the CPS legal system. 45% of professionals describe morally injurious events associated with systemic biases. These biases included systemic sexist, racist, or classist policies and practices. A CPS field worker who has been working for the county in child welfare since 1996 and described the moral and ethical consequences of an under-resourced system with overwhelming workers. And it's like the state telling us that we need to intervene on families, but then we don't have the resources to do it adequately. And how ethical is it to remove children from their families, or to get involved even without removal, when we don't have what we need to get the children home promptly? We've been in crisis, it feels like, for about 3 or 4 years. It just gets progressively worse and worse. The supervisor of MSW interns at the law clinic describes moral injury as emerging from system structures and processes that are not set up to effectively address the needs of children and families. She observes, the other part of things that I think really has changed my, worldview, I guess, is the ways in which our systems work. The systems that are supposed to be there to protect children and families that I have seen really do the opposite in the majority of the cases. I feel difficult as a social worker to so strongly not believe in one of the systems that is primarily run by social workers. The coordinator of the Parent Mentor Program said, I don't have trust in the justice system, especially when we're dealing with child protection. It's different than criminal court. In criminal court, you can kind of be vindicated. You can clear your name, or you can do the best you can. In child protection court, there is no justice. None whatsoever. There's no way to clear your name. Our fourth table illustrates the last event professionals cited as morally injurious. This includes the traumatization of children who are involved in the system. 45% of professionals describe morally injurious events associated with witnessing harm to children caused by child welfare involvement. A CPS worker with 14 years of experience explained, I think it's so much more traumatizing and damaging for kids to be outside of their environment and their extended support, and where we can't find those supports, it becomes challenging as to whether they're having their needs met in a foster home where they don't feel comfortable. Especially for those kiddos that may have more behavior challenges, to have it addressed adequately or to have it addressed appropriately, it's always a play in my head of, could we prevent some of these placements? Could we do something differently to avoid kids being traumatized by being in placement versus them being at home? Now we will move on to how professionals describe their responses to morally injurious events. This table illustrates these responses. Professionals described a variety of complex emotional, existential responses to morally injurious events, including psychosomatic responses or social emotional growth as a result of needing to cope with morally injurious events. The primary emotional response that professionals experienced stemming from morally injurious events was emotional distress, cited by 92% of the professionals, 94% of those who reported moral injury on the MEAS, and 1 of the 3 who did not. 42% of professionals described their responses to morally injurious events as existential questioning of their own identities as professionals, but also more generally about good and evil in the world. A few professionals described psychosomatic responses or social emotional growth associated with morally injurious events. Interestingly, some professionals described social emotional growth as a result of coping with the morally injurious events they experienced. A CPS investigator who has been on the job for about a year describes her responses to morally injurious events with her job as anger, frustration, betrayal. Like I said, I feel misinformed. Maybe even my schooling a little bit. And I feel shame because I don't feel that I'm living up to my own personal values and beliefs and morals, but my social work values as well. And it's painful, to practice like that every day. So sadness. There's sorrow, grief, a lot of feelings. When asked about the feelings that he experiences when he witnesses something that's morally questionable, a disposition worker in the public defender's office replied, "Emotionally, sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's just absolutely being deflated. That's a big one where you're like, I've had many a day where you think your 9 o'clock is going to be the toughest part of the day, and then by 4 o'clock you're like, the world is a horrible place." The parent mentor coordinator who uses her experiences in the system as motivation to continue to work with parents, explaining, "I feel powerless now while I'm working with these parents, but it's pushing me to be in a place because there are people that are sitting in places that have power that are not paying attention to what's happening to the people in the community. So I'm going to find my way in that place to begin to add value, to have something to say and something to bring, so that it can lessen the burden of the pain that's going out to people in the community." Although the focus of our interviews with professionals was on identifying morally injurious events and characterizing participants' responses, a number of professionals did spontaneously discuss behavioral outcomes of moral injury. One of the CPS social workers who's been working for the county in child welfare for 21 years described the problem with retention of workers who experience moral injury as a result of an under-resourced, overwhelmed system. People are coming in and they're not being adequately trained. This is per the new People's Reports. They're not getting the training. And when I look at the training curriculum, it's all about forms. It's not about why are we here? What are we doing? What does this mean? How do you deal with secondary trauma? The real deal things. So they're not receiving that kind of training. They're given way too many cases too fast, so our workload has doubled because people have been exhausted. Things are harder, and so more people leave. There's a lot of turnover. But then there's a lot of new supervisors and new managers, and sometimes they are harsh. Before they would have the patience to work through something with a staff person. But now it's just like, it's harsh. Consistent with this observation, a new CPS field worker on the job for 3 months is already searching for a new position. She reports being morally troubled because the CPS system is structured in a way that makes it impossible for her to do her job ethically. She believes that the Board of Social Work would take away her license if they only knew the poor quality of her practice, saying, "I don't want this life. I work 10, 12, 14 hours a day, and I'm not even at 18 cases yet. I'm about to go to 15, and I can't even imagine taking more. And watching all my coworkers, 3 people in my unit just quit, all the ones with more than a year of experience." She describes her initial training as inadequate and focused on paperwork. In response to a probe concerning what is most disturbing to her and what is pushing her out of the door, she responds, "I would say the volume of paperwork. I always thought I was pretty organized, but this challenges me in ways that I just can't keep up with. And everybody says this is normal." Our second research question asked whether or not professionals who report varying levels of moral injury differ in terms of demographics or professional role. In many respects, professionals occupying different positions within the complex CPS system reported strikingly similar perspectives and experiences. When elaborating on specific transgressions, 60% or more professionals from each subgroup pointed to problems because the system is under-resourced and ineffective, and with other professionals' behavior. Furthermore, 80% or more professionals in all subgroups reported experiencing emotional distress in relation to those morally injurious events. At the same time, clinic and parent support staff and county attorneys also expressed some distinct perspectives. Compared to the other subgroups of professionals, more clinic and parent support staff and fewer county attorneys expressed concern about the adversarial nature of the system, 80% and 0% respectively. Additionally, there was a distinction between clinic and parent support staff and county attorneys with problematic laws, policies, or procedures, 100% and 20% respectively. In general, county attorneys express greater faith in the legal system to operate fairly, especially if each professional performs his or her role appropriately. Furthermore, when elaborating on their responses to morally injurious events, all of the clinic and parent support staff, but none of the county attorneys, described existential issues arising from their CPS involvement. To give an illustration of these distinct responses, we'll present you with 3 case examples. Andrea is a midlife Latina who has been a county attorney working for 6 years with CPS. Similar to the other county attorneys, as well as participants in other professional subcategories, she acknowledged witnessing events that violated her moral code and being bothered by those events. Similar to the other county attorneys, and in contrast to the clinic and parent support staff, she describes no feelings of betrayal or of violating her own moral code. Similar to the other county attorneys, and in contrast to most participants in other professional subcategories, the average of her 6-point Likert moral injury subscale was 2.4, which is below the scale midpoint of 3. In responding to probes regarding how she feels about working within a system she described as having racial and social class biases, she focused on role boundaries. The role is to advise the department, and so, as long as decisions are made that don't contradict state law or department policy, I don't necessarily feel particularly troubled, except, I can always offer my opinion, and there have been cases where it's like, well, I think that maybe the more appropriate thing to do to maintain the safety or welfare of the child, or this maybe would be in the better interest of the child, but it's not my place as counsel. I can advise or counsel, but it's not my decision to make. The role of counsel is to state the facts. I guess any review of the facts is not clearly objective, but the facts are the facts. You can state the facts. It's not your role as the attorney to let the court know how you particularly feel. Sometimes the facts just don't weigh in the department's favor. So the facts to some degree speak for themselves, regardless of what the client's position is. Jamie is a white, female, midlife adult who's been a county attorney working in CPS for 16 years. She did acknowledge having witnessed events that violated her morals, using a 4.0 on transgressions others, but not feeling particularly troubled by these events, with a 1.0 on transgressions others troubled. The average of her 6-point Likert moral injury subscale is 2.3. Similar to the majority of participants in the other professional subcategories, she acknowledged that the CPS system is under-resourced and overloaded. The result is that some social workers are unable to be effective at their jobs, and a lack of timely available services for families. Similar to other county attorneys, however, she also verbalized a real confidence in the system as being moral and just. When directly asked if she felt comfortable with how the system works, she responded, "Yeah, I do. Even more so now than when I first started. I feel like pretty much everybody has a voice. You have me representing the agency, the GAL representing the best interest of the child. You always have attorneys for parents. In ICWA cases, we have tribes, so the tribes are represented. And I have to say that the judges are very good about accommodating the tribes in the sense of sometimes they'll call the morning of and say, we can't be there. Can we appeal by phone? Sure. They accommodate that. And parents have their own attorneys. I feel like there are good checks and balances." Jamie also spoke repeatedly about the supportive work environment she experienced in the county attorney's office. Her good relationships with her coworkers seemed to reinforce her belief that the system was moral and fair. For example, when confronted with situations that she finds sad or disturbing, she explained, "I would say most of the time when I read the petitions, 90% of the petitions are really sad, and even after doing this for a long period of time, it's just astonishing that people do this to their children. And we have such a supportive atmosphere in my office with the attorneys and paralegals and the secretaries. We all see the petitions because it's such a great working environment. You're all supported by each other. Morally, I think we're doing the right thing with the petitions. I don't feel like it's morally challenging. Sarah is a white female who provides services to the Child Protection Clinic. She is an experienced professional with over 17 years of experience in social work. Similar to other clinic and parent support staff, the average of her 6-point Likert moral injury subscales, 4.4, is above the scale midpoint of 3. Also, similar to the other clinic and parent support staff, she scored highest on the transgression other subscale, 5.5, but also above the scale midpoint on betrayal, with a 4, and transgression self, with 3.5. Sarah described that learning of parents' maltreatment of their children is morally troubling. When working with clients, she will come to understand these events within the context of the parent-child relationship and the circumstances of their lives, including stressors such as poverty, racism, intimate partner abuse, substance misuse, unmet mental health needs, etc. As she explained, I think every instance in work with clients, the longer I work with them or the more I work with them, the more I understand what is going on in their life, the less morally troubling it is to me. It's still sad. It's still disturbing. It's still wish it didn't happen, but it doesn't feel the same way. What has more strongly impacted Sarah's experience of moral injury, as noted previously, is the role of a system that is run by social workers that harms vulnerable families. Like many other participants, and unlike 4 of the 5 county attorneys, she described moral injury stemming from problematic laws and procedures. In elaborating her MEAS responses, she described increased pressure to remove children from their homes due to the death of a child who remained at home with an abusive mother. This case received much attention in the local news media, and public criticism of CPS resulted. We're deferring to remove and asking questions later and missing the whole narrative of the trauma of removal, and it's awful because nobody wants that headline. And not just the headline, nobody wants the child's death, to happen. But I think it's become more about the headline. Nobody wants the headline. So there are ways in which it becomes a numbers game. It has to at some level. We're traumatizing thousands of children because we're worried about one. That doesn't work very well. Similar to other clinic and parent support staff and the majority of student attorneys, Sarah also identified moral injury as resulting from the adversarial nature of the system. Additionally, similar to other clinic and support staff and the majority of GALs and CPS social workers, Sarah described existential responses to morally injurious events. In particular, she questioned her own role as a social worker and described her loss of trust in the system. I try not to be overly pessimistic or negative or blaming or all of that, but I really feel strongly about our child protection system and the way in which it is really broken. So that's where I'm troubled. I'm troubled by, as a social worker, what feels like my own complicity with it. I'm troubled by the ways in which we're failing families and society as a whole. In the current study, the responses of child welfare professionals to the MEAS and subsequent interviews suggest that they may have experienced moral injury in relation to events associated with their work in CPS. Their MEAS scores and narrative elaborations of their MEAS reports describe events roughly parallel with those in previous reports, in which moral injury occurs in reaction to events caused by one's own or another's actions in high-stakes situations that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Participants in the present study described experiences in the high-stakes context of CPS involvement, during which people or systems entrusted with helping vulnerable families instead cause harm to those families. Similar to the reports of parents involved with CPS, professionals described harm through under-resourced systems, problematic professionals, unfair laws and policies, abusive parents, an adversarial system, systemic biases based on race, social class, and gender, and harm to children within the system and poor quality services. In addition, professionals also communicated reactions in their narrative elaborations of the MEAS consistent with the existing moral injury literature. They describe feelings of anger and sadness, emotional numbing, and guilt and shame. With the exception of county and student attorneys, the majority of professionals in all other subcategories describe troubling existential issues. Some professionals express deep doubts about their abilities to function in an ethical and moral manner within a system they viewed as deeply flawed, and in an unsupportive working environment steeped in human misery. Given their existential challenges, it is perhaps unsurprising that nearly a third of all professionals discussed that they were considering, or that their colleagues had already sought, employment elsewhere, sometimes in other professions. Clearly, the present study is only a first step in exploring the complex phenomenon of moral injury in professionals involved with CPS. In terms of the qualitative component, we only conducted one interview per participant. Thus, important themes emerging relatively late in the interview process were not systematically probed in all participants, particularly the participants' experience of moral injury and their thoughts or plans for leaving their jobs or professions. In terms of the quantitative component, the subgroups of professionals are too small to make conclusive comparisons. There are multiple interpretations of why subgroups such as county attorneys and the clinic and parent support staff may differ that will need to be explored in subsequent research. The consistent reports of moral injury among professionals in the present study, the convergence of their reports with those of CPS-involved parents, and the existing literature on moral injury in other populations suggest that moral injury may be a challenge experienced by some professionals. Yet moral injury has been overlooked as an unintended negative consequence of professionals' involvement with CPS that may undercut their abilities to perform their jobs protecting children and strengthening families. More research is clearly needed to examine the prevalence of moral injury among the general population of CPS-involved professionals to understand the scope of the potential problem. If moral injury is a relatively common experience among professionals involved with child welfare, then the primary implication is for policymakers and administrators concerned with supporting and retaining competent, ethically engaged professionals. Many professionals in the present study described inadequate support and resources within their workplace for dealing with human misery and an overwhelmed system that too often caused additional harm to already vulnerable families. Many of these professionals were considering leaving their employment or observing the departure of their colleagues. The results of this study suggest important areas of future research, which will in turn help to inform practice. This includes examining moral injury in the CPS context with a larger sample of professionals to understand the extent of the problem and identify sources of risk and resiliency. Future research also should identify any protective factors for moral injury that may be built upon in interventions to educate, prevent, and/or address moral injury in CPS housing. Additional research clearly is needed to examine how any moral injury is experienced by individuals differently positioned not only with their respective profession, but other identities such as ethnicity and gender as well. This concludes our module on moral injury among professionals in the CPS system. Please review our references for literature that inform this study. For more information on our research, please contact Wendy Haight at whaight@umn.edu. Thank you.